I've always loved Christmas. The lights, the snow, the feeling of the holiday season. It was always my favorite time of year. But after what happened to me on Christmas Eve of 2018, I don't think I'll ever look at Christmas decorations the same way again. At the time, I was 23 years old and living with my parents. In a quiet suburb in Ohio, my parents had decided to go on a cruise for the holidays, so I had the entire house to myself. I didn't mind. I was looking forward to a quiet night of playing video games, eating pizza, and just relaxing without any family drama. It was around 6 p.m. when I ordered a pizza. It was already dark outside, and a light snow had been falling since the afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, which faces the front of the house, waiting for the delivery driver. Our front porch is pretty big. My mom goes all out with decorations every year. We had lights wrapped around the pillars, wreaths on the windows, and a few plastic reindeer on the lawn. But there was one decoration I didn't recognize. I was looking out the window, checking for the pizza guy's headlights, when I noticed a figure sitting on the wooden bench we keep on the porch. It was a life-sized Santa Claus. It was sitting perfectly still, facing the street. I frowned, confused. I didn't remember seeing it earlier that day when I came home from work. I assumed my mom must have bought it before they left and maybe asked one of the neighbors to set it up as a surprise. Or maybe I was just unobservant and walked right past it earlier. It looked cheap. The suit was a bright velvety red, but the face was that shiny pale plastic that old Christmas decorations have. It had a stiff white beard and black boots. It was just sitting there, arms resting on the armrests of the bench, staring blankly into the yard. The pizza driver pulled up a few minutes later. I grabbed my wallet and opened the front door. The cold air hit me instantly as I stepped out to meet the driver on the steps. I had to walk right past the Santa figure. Up close, it looked even more unsettling. It was slumped slightly to the left. I remember thinking it was weirdly large for a decoration, bulkier than the usual wireframe things my mom bought. I didn't touch it, but I gave it a weird look as I paid the driver and took the boxes. "Nice decoration," the driver said, nodding toward the bench. Startled me when I walked up. "Yeah, thanks," I said. "My mom loves this stuff." I went back inside, locked the door, and ate my dinner. I tried to focus on my game, but for some reason that Santa on the porch kept popping into my head. It was just the way it sat there. It looked too heavy, too solid. Around 9 p.m., the wind started to pick up. I heard a loud thump against the front wall of the house. I muted the TV and listened. It sounded like something had fallen over. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. The Santa figure wasn't on the bench anymore. I scanned the porch and saw it lying face down on the floorboards right in front of the door. The wind must have blown it over. I sighed, annoyed that I had to go out in the cold to pick it up, but I didn't want it to blow into the driveway and get run over. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. I stepped onto the porch in my socks. "Stupid thing," I muttered. I bent down to grab the Santa by the shoulder to hoist it back onto the bench. The moment my hand grabbed the fabric of the suit, my stomach dropped. It didn't feel like plastic or wire. It felt like a heavy winter coat over a solid mass. It felt like a person. Before I could process what I was touching, the figure on the ground suddenly tensed up. A low, guttural growl came from underneath the mask. I screamed and scrambled backwards, slipping on the wet porch. The Santa scrambled to its feet with terrifying speed. It wasn't a stiff mechanical motion, it was fluid and aggressive. The plastic mask was still strapped to his face, staring at me with that frozen, happy smile. But the eyes behind the eye holes were wide and frantic. He lunged at me. I threw myself back inside the house, slamming the door just as a heavy body collided with it. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my hands shaking violently, and managed to click it into place just as the doorknob began to rattle aggressively. "Open the door, or I'll break it down." I didn't answer. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife from the block, and sprinted upstairs to my parents' bedroom. I locked that door too, and immediately dialed 911. "There's a man on my porch," I whispered to the operator, huddling in a corner of the room. "He was dressed as a decoration. He's trying to get in." While I was on the phone, I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. He had broken the small window on the front door. I heard the lock click. He was inside. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I was going to pass out. I heard heavy, wet boots stomping on the hardwood floor of the entryway. "Hello," the voice called out. It sounded taunting. "Now I just want to give you a present." I stayed dead silent, tears streaming from my face. The operator was telling me to stay on the line and that officers were 2 minutes away. Footsteps moved into the living room, then the kitchen. He was looking for me. Then I heard the creak of the stairs. He was coming up. The steps were slow and deliberate. I watched the gap under the bedroom door. I saw a shadow block the hallway light. The doorknob slowly turned. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. The door didn't open. I had locked it. Then the banging started. He threw his weight against the door, and the wood frame cracked. "I know you're in there," he screamed, just as the... This story takes place back in the summer of 2015. I'm 29 now, but at the time I was just 19 years old. I had been working at a Chick-fil-A in Reno, NV since I was 16, which was a decent high school job, but I was ready for something bigger. When I turned 19, I landed a really good paying job in San Francisco, California. I was ecstatic. I had an interview orientation scheduled for a Friday, so I figured I would drive down on Thursday, stay in a cheap Airbnb for the weekend, and get a feel for the city before I officially moved. It was a Thursday afternoon when I packed up my car and headed out. Things were fine at first, but once I started driving away from Reno and into the mountains of California along I-80, things took a turn. I was about an hour away from Reno, deep in that stretch of highway where it's just mountains and trees. I looked down at my dashboard and my stomach dropped. My gas light was on. I checked my GPS and it said the next reliable gas station was about 30 miles away. I was super irritated with myself for not filling up before I left. I watched the needle dip below the empty line and panic set in. I knew I wasn't going to make it 30 miles. I saw a sign for an exit coming up. It wasn't a main town exit. It was one of those obscure exits that led to a 2-lane road winding into the forest. I didn't have a choice. I pulled off, hoping to find a local pump or a house. Of course, my bad feeling became a reality. I made it about 6 miles away from the interstate when my engine sputtered, the power steering locked up, and the car rolled to a silent stop on the shoulder. It was dead silent out there, just tall pines and the sound of the wind. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but looking at the screen, I had absolutely no service, no signal. I sat there for a while, just gripping the steering wheel, trying not to freak out. About 10 minutes later, I saw a car coming down the road in the rearview mirror. It slowed down as it approached me. It was an ocean gray Nissan Altima. I felt a wave of relief. I thought, finally, a local who can help me. The Nissan pulled up right next to my car, window to window. But the driver didn't roll his window down. He just sat there. The car idled. I waited for him to say something. He didn't. He just sat there for what felt like 10 minutes. The relief I felt started to turn into anxiety. Why was he stopping if he wasn't going to talk? Eventually, I rolled down my window a crack. I called out, "Hey, do you need help?" The driver slowly turned his head to look at me. My blood ran cold. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and his jaw was clenching and unclenching. He looked like he was heavily on drugs. He didn't speak. He just stared at me with this tense, predatory look. I got so scared I rolled my window up immediately. Then the man opened his door. He got out of the Nissan. He was tall and wearing dirty clothes, but instead of coming to my door, he turned and just walked straight into the woods. He didn't look back. He just walked into the tree line and disappeared. I was questioning everything. Was this a setup? Was someone else in the woods? I was planning on maybe getting out and running to a house I had passed a mile back. But then I remembered something. My dad had put a small emergency gas can in the back of my trunk when I first bought the car. I had completely forgotten about it. I was saved. I popped the trunk, grabbed the red plastic can, and frantically poured the gas into the tank. I kept looking at the woods, expecting that man to come charging out. As soon as the can was empty, I threw it in the trunk, jumped in the driver's seat, and prayed the car would start. It sputtered once, then roared to life. I speeded out of there. I didn't look back. I drove way over the speed limit until I got back onto I-80. I drove to the next major gas station, which was packed with people. I finally felt safe. I filled up my tank all the way, went inside to use the restroom, and bought a bunch of snacks just to calm my nerves. I walked back out to my car, opening a bag of chips. As I reached for my door handle, I froze. Parked 2 pumps over was an ocean gray Nissan Altima. It can't be, I thought. It's a popular car. Then I saw it. On the passenger side door, there was a large, distinctive patch of blue paint, as if it had scraped a pole. It was the same car from the woods. My heart was hammering in my throat. I didn't look to see where the driver was. I jumped into my car and flew out of the parking lot, merging back onto the highway as fast as I could. I kept checking my rearview mirror. For about 20 minutes, I thought I was in the clear. Then I saw it. The gray Altima with the blue spot. He was a few cars back, weaving through traffic. I was not far from Sacramento at this point. I tried to drive casually, hoping he would pass me, but he didn't. He stayed right on my tail. I figured the car would lose track of me if I exited and made some random turns. I took an exit, made 3 rights and a left, and then got back on the highway a few miles down. Once I was in Sacramento, the traffic got heavier. I looked in the mirror. He was still there. He was about 4 cars behind me. Then I saw a police cruiser in the lane next to him. But the driver of the Nissan didn't slow down. In fact, he sped up. He aggressively cut across 2 lanes and came up right behind my bumper. He rammed the back of my car. I gripped the wheel, trying to keep control. I saw the Nissan swerve violently after hitting me. He lost traction, spun out across the lane, and smashed head-on into a metal exit sign on the side of the road. Steam hissed up from his hood. The police officer I had seen earlier hit his lights immediately. I pulled over to the shoulder, shaking uncontrollably. The officer ran to the Nissan with his gun drawn. I waited by my car. More officers and an ambulance arrived within minutes. I gave my statement to the police, telling them everything from the woods to the gas station to the chase. The driver wasn't seriously hurt. He stumbled out of the car and I heard him yelling at the cops that he had just fallen asleep at the wheel. We didn't believe it for a second. You don't follow someone for 50 miles and ram them because you fell asleep. The police searched his vehicle before towing it. An officer came over to me a while later, looking grim. He told me that they found a loaded semi-automatic rifle in the passenger seat, covered by a jacket. When they were handcuffing the man, he started yelling threats at me. He was yelling things like, "You're lucky the cops are here," and claiming he used the rifle for hunting, even though it wasn't hunting season, and he was driving towards San Francisco. He was arrested for disorderly conduct, reckless driving, and a weapons charge. I eventually got over the experience, and it took a long time to feel comfortable driving alone on the highway again. My family actually moved to San Francisco a few years later, so I have people close by now. I try not to think about it too much, but whenever the topic of road trips comes up, I tell them the full story. I don't know what he wanted, but knowing he had that rifle sitting next to him,
the whole time makes me realize just how lucky I was to get away. This happened back in the late 80s or maybe the very early 90s. I was young, probably 6 or 7 years old at the time. My sister was significantly older, about 14 or 15. We grew up in one of those small, dusty towns in West TX, where the landscape is flat and you can see the horizon in every direction. It was the kind of place where people claimed everyone knew everybody, and folks often left their doors unlocked during the day because nothing ever happened here. On this particular night, our parents were out for the evening. I don't remember where they went, maybe a dinner or a town meeting, but my sister babysitting me was a frequent occurrence. We actually got along really well, mostly because of the age gap. She didn't see me as a rival, just a little brother she had to keep alive for a few hours. It was winter, and if you've never been to the high desert in Texas, you might not realize how bitterly cold it gets once the sun drops. By 8 p.m., it was pitch black outside. The wind was howling, which was normal for us. It's a constant droning sound that rattles the siding and whistles through the cracks in the window frames. We were in the common room, which was the main hangout spot, because that's where the big TV was. We were curled up watching one of those gritty news magazine shows on CBS. I think it was 48 Hours, or maybe Hard Copy. It was one of those programs that dramatized real crimes, kidnappings, murders, trafficking. Basically a horror movie presented as news. The story that night was terrifyingly close to home, at least conceptually. It was about a quiet guy living in a nice suburban neighborhood who suddenly snapped. He went on a rampage in his next-door neighbor's house and ended up kidnapping their young daughter. I remember feeling that specific kind of childhood dread where the safety of your own living room starts to feel fragile. To understand why what happened next was so scary, you have to understand the layout of our house. The common room where we were sitting had a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, including a large sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Because it was night and we didn't have the porch light on, that entire wall was just a sheet of black glass. If you looked at it, you only saw your own reflection staring back. You couldn't see anything looking in. On the opposite side of the room was the entryway leading to the front door. The front door was solid wood. You couldn't see through it, but it had a heavy glass storm door on the outside. We were about 45 minutes into the show. The narrator on TV was talking about the ongoing manhunt for the neighbor, building up the tension. The house was quiet, except for the TV and the wind outside. Suddenly, 3 incredibly loud, violent bangs hit the front door. It didn't sound like a knock. It sounded like someone was trying to punch through the wood. My sister and I both jumped off the floor and screamed. It was a pure instinctual reaction. Then dead silence. We stood there, hearts hammering against our ribs. The only light in the house came from the TV screen and the faint yellow glow of the kitchen light down the hall. We didn't move. We were waiting to hear a voice, a car engine, anything. It was probably just the wind, my sister hissed, though her voice was shaking. In West TX, the wind can pick up planters or heavy debris and slam them against the house. We had a heavy rocking chair and some clay pots on the porch. It was a logical explanation. We stood there for a minute or two, letting the adrenaline fade, convincing ourselves that a gust of wind had just blown something over. Just as we were about to sit back down and laugh it off, we heard a sound that froze my blood. It was the distinct sound of the hydraulic pump on the glass storm door closing. The wind can bang on a door, but the wind cannot open a storm door, hold it open while banging on the solid door, and then let it close gently. Someone had been standing right there, inches away from us, separated only by the wood. We were paralyzed in the middle of the room. We knew someone was outside. We knew they had just tried the front door and found it locked. My sister dropped into a crouch and crawled over to the television. It was an old set, the kind with the metal knobs you had to physically turn. She reached up and clicked the dial to off. The screen went black. The room plunged into near total darkness, lit only by that weak kitchen light spilling in from the hallway. I don't know how long we stayed like that. I was on the floor, sitting on my heels, trembling. My sister was crouched by the TV. We kept making wide-eyed contact, then looking at the front door, waiting for the knob to turn or the wood to splinter. But the noise didn't come from the front door. I was facing the back wall, the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. I saw something move. The brass knob of the back glass door began to rotate. It was slow at first, deliberate. I watched the metal turn to the right, hit the lock mechanism, and then stop. It rattled slightly, barely making a sound, as if the person on the other side was gently testing it, hoping it was open. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my throat was closed tight. Then the subtlety vanished. The person outside lost their patience. They started jerking the door handle back and forth with terrifying force. The entire wall of windows began to vibrate violently. Because the room was dark and there was a tiny bit of light coming from the kitchen, I could see the reflection of the room in the glass. With every violent yank of the door, my reflection in the glass would get fuzzy, then clear, then fuzzy again as the pane warped under the pressure. My sister absolutely flipped out. She let out a scream that sounded like she was being murdered. I was still frozen, stuck in that deer in headlights paralysis. She didn't leave me though. She scrambled over, grabbed my arm, and basically dragged me across the carpet. "Go, go," she hissed. We ran down the hall and into her bedroom. She slammed her door and locked it, but that flimsy bedroom lock didn't feel like enough. She started grabbing everything she could, her desk chair, a heavy hamper, and finally she flipped her mattress off the frame and shoved it against the door. She scrambled for her phone. It was one of those old-school beige portable phones with a long metal antenna that you had to pull out, and it weighed a ton. In her panic, her mind went blank. She needed to call the sheriff, but this was before 911 was universally reliable in rural areas, and you had to dial the direct 7-digit number for the local station. She couldn't remember it. She just hit the redial button. It rang once, twice. Someone picked up. It was her best friend. "Hello? Someone is breaking in," my sister screamed, her voice cracking into broken gasps. "You need to get here. Tell your dad someone is trying to get into the house right now." I remember being shocked by her swearing. I had never heard her use the F word before. It made the situation feel even more real, even more desperate. I was curled up in the corner of her room, hugging my knees, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. We sat there in the dark, behind the mattress, waiting. We were waiting to hear the sound of breaking glass, of footsteps coming down the hall. But the house went silent again. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 minutes later when we saw lights sweep across the bedroom window. A car was coming up the driveway. My sister peeked through the blinds. "It's them!" she cried. It was her friend's parents. They had driven over at breakneck speed. We heard the car door slam and her dad yelling. We finally moved the mattress and ran out to meet them. Her dad had a tire iron in his hand, looking around the yard. We never found out who it was. The police arrived shortly after. They walked the perimeter of the house with big flashlights. There were no footprints because the ground was frozen hard, but when they looked at the back glass door, they found fresh scuff marks on the bottom of the frame, like someone had been kicking at it while pulling the handle. Whoever it was had tried the front door, realized it was locked, circled to the back, saw us sitting there in the dim light, and tried to force their way in. When we screamed and ran, they must have realized the element of surprise was gone and took off into the dark. Nothing like that ever happened to us again.
I worked at a gas station for about 4 years in a super small town in Ohio. You know the kind of town, one stoplight, high school, and miles of cornfields surrounding everything. I was particularly used to working the night shift. Most people hated it, but I didn't mind. It was usually dead, so I could sit behind the counter, read magazines, or scroll on my phone and do absolutely nothing. Plus, I was a night owl, so I liked sleeping in during the day. I remember this specific night vividly. It was a Tuesday in late October. I started my shift around 7 p.m. The sun was already down, and the fluorescent lights of the canopy outside were buzzing loudly. My coworker, a guy named Dave, gave me the rundown of the register, grabbed his keys, and left shortly after I arrived. "See you later. Don't fall asleep," he joked as he walked out. The door chime, a loud, piercing ring as he exited. That chime is important. It was an older system, loud enough to wake the dead. There was absolutely no way to enter or leave that store without that sound echoing through the entire building. Once Dave's tail lights faded down the road, I was all alone. I locked the back office door, which was standard protocol, and settled onto the stool behind the counter. The first hour was quiet. I stocked some cigarettes, wiped down the counter, and then just sat there. 7 p.m. turned to 8 p.m., then 9 p.m. I didn't have a single customer. This wasn't entirely unusual for a Tuesday night, but usually you get at least one person coming in for gas or a pack of smokes. But tonight, it was dead silence. The only noise was the hum of the Slurpee machine and the occasional car passing by on the highway, never stopping. By 10 p.m., I had been sitting there for 3 hours. I was bored out of my mind, scrolling through Twitter, barely paying attention to the room because I knew the chime would alert me if anyone came in. Then, the silence was shattered. A loud crash came from the back of the store. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped my phone. My heart instantly hammered against my ribs. I looked toward the back corner where the customer restrooms. The men's bathroom door flew open with such force that the handle punched a hole in the drywall. A man came stumbling out, practically burning rubber on the tile floor. He was a big guy, maybe 6'2", wearing a dirty flannel shirt and jeans that looked covered in dust or drywall. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The chime hadn't rung, not once in 3 hours. The man stopped dead in the center of the aisle, right in front of the chips display. He looked wild. He was sweating profusely, his hair matted to his forehead. His chest was heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with me. We stared at each other for what felt like a minute, but was probably only 5 seconds. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and terrifyingly intense. He didn't look drunk. He looked like an animal that had been cornered. "Hey," I managed to shout, my voice cracking. "The store's closed." I don't know why I said that. The store was open 24/7. I was just panicked. The man didn't say a word. He just let out this weird guttural grunt, then bolted. He sprinted full speed toward the front door. He hit the push bar so hard the glass rattled. The chime finally rang as he burst out into the night, disappearing around the corner of the building toward the dark fields behind the station. I stood there, shaking. I looked at the clock. 10:15 p.m. I grabbed the landline phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? A guy ran out of the bathroom? He hadn't robbed me. He hadn't attacked me. But then the logic hit me, and it made my stomach turn. I had been there since 7 p.m. Nobody had entered, which meant he had been in that bathroom before I even started my shift. He had been in there for over 3 hours. What was he doing in there for that long? And why did he run out looking like that? I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight we kept under the counter for protection and walked slowly toward the back of the store. The air felt heavy. The men's room door was still wide open. I approached the doorway cautiously, half expecting someone else to jump out. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I stepped inside. The motion sensor light clicked on. The bathroom was small, just a toilet and a sink. It smelled terrible, a mix of old urine and something else, something metallic. The toilet seat was down, the sink was dry. But then I looked at the floor. There was drywall dust everywhere. White powder covered the tiles. I looked up. My heart dropped into my stomach. The acoustic drop ceiling tiles above the toilet had been pushed aside. There was a gaping black square leading into the crawl space above the store. On the toilet tank, there were 2 muddy boot prints. He hadn't been using the bathroom. He had been on the ceiling. And then I saw it. On the floor,
Right where he must have landed when he jumped down was a long, serrated hunting knife. It was rusted, but the edge looked freshly sharpened. I ran to the front, locked the door, and called 911 immediately. When the police arrived, they searched the crawl space. They found a sleeping bag rolled out on the insulation, a few empty bottles of water, and a peephole. The guy had bored a tiny hole through the ceiling tile directly above the register. The police officer told me that based on the trash up there, the guy had probably been living in our ceiling for a week. He would wait for the night shift, watch the employee from above, and come down when the store was empty to steal food or do whatever else he planned. But that wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was what they found next to the sleeping bag. It was a notebook. It was filled with times and dates. Monday, girl with red hair left at 11 p.m. Tuesday, old guy left at 10 p.m. And the last entry, written in shaky handwriting, Tuesday, new kid sleeps at 2 a.m. Do it then. The reason he had come burning out of the bathroom wasn't that he was lost. He slipped. The police found a broken support beam up there. He had been positioning himself to drop down behind me, but the beam snapped. He fell into the bathroom and panicked when he realized he had made too much noise. If that beam hadn't broken, he would have waited until 2 a.m. I usually take a nap around then. I quit the next morning. I don't work night shifts anymore.
People always tell you to be careful about who you meet online. They warn you about the catfishers, the scammers, and the obvious creeps. But nobody warns you about the person who looks perfect, the nice, quiet girl who just wants a friend. I was new to the city, desperate for cheap rent, and honestly pretty lonely. That's why I was on the app. I wasn't looking for a date. I just wanted to find a roommate who wasn't a total stranger. That is how I found Bia. Her profile was wholesome. She looked like a nice country girl with a big smile, wearing an Akubra hat, posing with a golden retriever. She listed a room for rent in a large house she shared with her family for only $400 a week. In this economy, that was an absolute steal. I swiped right, messaged her, and we hit it off immediately. She seemed like the sister I never had when I moved in. Everything seemed perfect. The house was huge, an older two-story place with thick walls. Bia explained that her family owned a nightclub in the city, so they were gone all night working and slept during the day. That meant we had the whole place to ourselves every evening. Bia was helpful, respectful, and almost too eager to please. We were attached at the hip for the first few weeks, but looking back, it wasn't friendship, it was grooming. The red flags started small. She didn't just want to hang out, she wanted to be me. She started buying the same clothes I wore. Then she dyed her hair the same shade of brown as mine. When I laughed it off, she just smiled and said, "Twins." Then the controls started. It wasn't like a boyfriend-girlfriend type of jealousy. It was something far more sinister. She expected me to be her live-in doll. The family she lived with, her mother and brother, were rarely seen. In fact, I had never actually laid eyes on them. I only heard them, specifically the mother, if I didn't clean the kitchen perfectly, or if I mentioned going out to see my friend Jim. Bia would get quiet. She would look at the ceiling nervously. Then from the upstairs room, I'd hear her mother screaming through the floorboards. "She's been bad, Bea. She needs to be punished. Don't let her leave." The voice would screech. It was a raspy, angry sound that made my skin crawl. Bia would come downstairs looking sad but firm. "Mother is upset with you. You shouldn't have left the house. You know she has a temper." It turned into a prison. They forced me to install Life 360 on my phone so they could track my every move. If I went to the park, I'd get a text immediately. "Mother says come home now." I started losing weight. Bia handled the cooking because Mother didn't want me in the kitchen. She began giving me tiny portions, pigeon food, she called it, while she ate normally. If I complained, she'd say I was being ungrateful to her family after they gave me such cheap rent.
I was paying to be starved and held captive in a house. It always felt cold. One day, Bia told me about a girl named May. She said May was a crazy stalker who used to live there, but had been kicked out for stealing. She showed me a blurry photo of May. She looked a lot like me. The breaking point was the night of the party. Bia insisted I come to work with her to make up for being difficult. We went and she fed me soda. I remember the room spinning. I didn't feel drunk, I felt drugged. My limbs felt heavy like lead. I managed to stumble away and found a couple, Amy and Jake, near the exit. They saw I was in distress. I could barely speak, but I managed to tell them I needed to go home. They were kind enough to drive me. I stumbled into the house and passed out in my room. When I woke, the sun was cutting through the blinds. My head was pounding. I checked my phone. I had 50 missed calls from Bia. Then I saw the texts. "Unlock the door. Mother is coming in. You can't leave me." The house was dead silent. I crept out of my room, needing water. The hallway was shadowed. That's when I passed Mother's room. The door, usually locked tight, was slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew I shouldn't look, but curiosity took over. I pushed the door open. There was no Mother. The room was empty. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. There was no bed, no dresser, no clothes. There was just a single wooden chair in the middle of the room. On a small table next to the chair was a high-end microphone setup connected to a terrifyingly complex system of wires running into the walls. Bia didn't live with her family. She lived alone. The voices, the screaming mother, the angry brother, it was all her. She had been sitting in that chair performing a play for an audience of one. I felt sick to my stomach. I turned to leave, but then I saw a pile of mail on the floor near the closet. It was addressed to May. I walked over to the closet in the fake mother's room. I opened it. May wasn't a stalker. May hadn't been kicked out. May's driver's license, her clothes, her purse, and her phone were all piled in the back of the closet. They were covered in stiff brown stains. It looked like dried makeup at first, but the metallic smell hit me instantly. It was blood. Then I heard the front door unlocked downstairs. My blood ran cold. I heard the heavy boots of a country girl coming up the stairs. She was moving fast. "I know you're in there," Bia's voice called out. It was cheerful, almost singing. But then her voice shifted. It dropped into that screeching, raspy old woman tone I'd feared for months. "She's been bad, hasn't she, Bea?" She went into Mother's room. I didn't wait. I didn't try to hide. I grabbed the heavy lamp from the hallway table and smashed the window at the end of the hall. "What are you doing?" Bea screamed, her voice shifting back to her own. I climbed onto the roof. It was a 2-story drop to the backyard. I didn't look down. I jumped. I hit the grass hard. I felt a sharp snap in my ankle, and blinding pain shot up my leg. I screamed, but I forced myself up. I hobbled, ran, and crawled toward the main road. I didn't stop running until I flagged down a passing police car. I told them everything. I told them about the room, the microphone, and the blood. They raided the house. They found Bea sitting in the mother's room talking to herself in different voices. They found May's body buried in the dirt floor of the basement. She had been missing for 6 months. The police told me she had been disciplined by her mother. I was supposed to be next. So, to the nice country girl with the fake family and the voices in her head, let's not meet again.